Not everybody may know the tax, right? So there's this sort of precedent for the temple tax. Well, there's no more temple. So what is there now? There's Zion. So this is very much the case that a number of American Jews in the early 1900s did not want to go to Zion, but they wanted Zion. So they didn't pay the temple tax. They underwrote the modern nation of Israel. And that still happens, right? That happens through private donors. That also happens through U.S. aid. Has anybody other than Kathy and Betty been to Israel? Yeah. Israel is more technologically advanced than most countries in Europe. Like, if I had a choice between going to the doctor, if I was hurt in Spain, I would fly here. If I was hurt in Italy, I would fly back here. If I was hurt in Israel, I'd be glad because I'd get better care there than I would here, even at the medical center.
Lance fell and cut his finger to the bone, and we got the ambulance ride because half the city was shut down for a marathon, and they said they didn't want to let us in a taxi.
Yeah.
And we went to the emergency room, and he got an antibiotic shot, and they stitched up his finger, and they gave him some antibiotics to take home with him, and they did x-rays, and we had to pay the expensive tourist price of $300.
Yeah, I mean, so
I think your medical is a bit scratched. We've had no problem in France. We've had no problem in Ireland. It's been every bit as good as here.
Yeah, not complaining. I'm saying that the medical center in Tel Aviv, I would put up against the medical center in Houston.
Oh, yeah.
Which I would not say for Spain or Italy, just to be clear. The care is probably fine, right? But even international reputation. And again, what's doing that is Jewish people all over the world are subsidizing Zion, whether they choose to go there or not. Right. So this is probably a very common element that you'll hear from Jewish people today is we may not want to live there, but it's really important to us that there is a Jewish homeland. And that has to do with centuries of pogroms and the Holocaust as well. So last week we talked a little bit about, hey, there's Orthodoxy and there's Hasidism and there's, the conservative and there's Reform. And then we didn't talk about Zionism because it's not its own thing. It kind of permeates most levels. As I mentioned to you, if you have a Jewish burial, you want land from Israel in your grave. Like that's a thing. So when something like this happens in the Jewish identity, whether you have any beliefs or not, this is a threat to your Jewish identity. It's another pogrom. So it's really important to understand like an attack on Israel is an attack on identity, even maybe more so than a regular thing. We're not talking about shoulds. It's just important to understand that, right? And the reason there needs to be a safe place is the Holocaust, right?
I have a question. Geographically, I'm ignorant. I'll just say that. I was looking at a map of Israel, and I don't understand. The West Bank is like in the middle of Israel, and then there's the Gaza Strip. Are those both under Palestinian control?
They are.
Okay, so the Palestinians control who goes into the West Bank?
No, the Israelis control who goes into the West Bank.
Okay.
Let me draw you a diagram.
I'm just like
I don't know why the TV's not working, okay. And it's just I only had 2 slides left in the show anyway. But look, here's a terrible picture of Israel, and here's the Sea of Galilee, and there's the Jordan River, and there's the Dead Sea. So when we talk about the West Bank, we're talking about the western bank of the Jordan River, right? And that's why it's called the West Bank, right? And then the Gaza Strip is like somewhere down here on the coast. Okay. So sure, they've got autonomy in those areas. Palestinian government has autonomy, but as I mentioned, oh, by the way, and then there's like Bethlehem is sort of like down here outside of Jerusalem. It's right there. There's like a really big wall here. It's like 20 feet tall. Think about the Berlin Wall or what some people would like to build between us and Mexico. That happened. So great. You control everything in here, but how do you get in there? Well, the only way in through a road is from this territory. So who decides who travels those roads? The people occupying this territory. That's Israel.
Right.
I mean, I guess you could roll up here on a boat, but you can't roll up here on a boat.
Yeah.
So you tell me who controls who comes in and out.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No.
Okay, well, who controls like the interior of the West Bank then?
Inside the fence, it's Palestinian.
Yeah.
Inside there.
Yeah.
Go ahead, make your own landfill in there.
Yeah.
But it can't go out down here to the Negev where no one lives, because that's ours. That's not yours.
So those that are already in there, like, just stay in there. Is that correct? Like, people
stay.
They stay in there. So it's
some
like,
people describe this as the Palestinian ghetto.
that's what I was just about to say. It's like a ghetto. That's like a ghetto, and then I guess the Gaza Strip also.
Yeah. Now,
like
if you're an Israeli,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
These people want to kill you.
Right.
So you need a wall.
Right.
By the way, I'm not saying either position is wrong. I'm saying this is why this kind of thing, unfortunately, is going to happen until something changes on the map.
Right.
I'm afraid. Like, I don't want to be cynical, but like, I think that's the deal.
So the things that are in the West Bank, though, I'd say things like places where people.
Housing and the shops and things, do you mean?
No, I mean like religious things, like
the mosques in the West Bank.
The mosques and what Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
Not in the West Bank. That's in Jerusalem.
That's in Jerusalem. Okay, but are there other?
Yeah, actually, one of the
things that are
like one of the most important shrines for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is here in this town called Hebron or Hebron, and that's the burial place of Abraham and Sarah.
Okay.
And if you want to go there on a tour, on a pilgrimage, you have to sign a waiver that you cannot collect any life insurance if you're killed there.
Oh my goodness.
You can't hold the travel agency in any way responsible, and you have to travel on an armored bus, because often people who live in Hebron might choose to shoot at tourist buses because they don't want tourists coming in there.
Right.
So on the pilgrimage we were theoretically taking in January for the diocese, TBD if we're doing that.
Yes.
I really wanted to go to Hebron, and the bishop said, I don't think we should do that.
Okay.
I mean, it's the burial place of Abraham and Sarah.
Yes.
Right? Which all three of us hold to be a thing. But it has two entrances. It has the Muslim entrance, must be Muslim to enter here, and then it has the miscellaneous entrance.
Okay.
All
right.
Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Baha'i, whatever, right? So it's even segregated within Hebron.
Wow. Okay.
Other segregation happens in the city of Jerusalem. There is arguably like the most beautiful building I've ever seen, and it's sitting on top of this mount, and it's called the Dome of the Rock.
Right.
Okay.
And since 2000, you can't go there. 2002, you can't go there unless you're Muslim. You can stroll around. You can't approach it. You can get up on the Temple Mount for a couple hours on a Friday if you're a Gentile. No Jewish person would do that because you could inadvertently walk over the Holy of Holies, right? But you can't. I mean, I went in it in 2000, and it's amazing. That's that gold domed building, maybe you've seen. But you can't go there now. You can't go, and nor can you go to the oldest mosque in Jerusalem, which is not the Dome of the Rock. It's the Dome of the Chain. It's also called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is just kind of probably 50 yards away. That has to do with politics. It doesn't have to do with religion.
Yeah.
Religion gets blamed for the politics. It's politics.
Okay.
Actually, Jewish people and Muslims didn't have any problem until until this whole Palestinian land question showed up in the early 1900s.
So
that's where I wanted to go. So, but how did we get to the West Bank and how did
Well, I mean, we probably need to go back older than that, right? We need to go back to where I mentioned to you historically, there were these pogroms happening in Russia, and they were happening frequently. They also happened throughout Europe. They happened in Spain. And there were some ideas, you know, frankly, among Jewish elites in Europe that we need our own territory. And it wasn't immediately people said we should go back to the promised land. It was like, there were all kinds of ideas about where they should go and have like a Jewish island or a Jewish country where you could sort of live knowing that there wouldn't be pogroms. They ended up, though, with the idea, let's go back to Palestine. And you probably know, if you've read, Theodor Herzl, Herzl, was one of the first advocates, one of the biggest mouthpieces for the Jewish homeland, and let's go to Palestine. And you can read some books about this. I mean, Palestine was pretty bucolic and pastoral. I mean, it was very much like Spain. People who lived there had lived there for generations. They built homes. They had established farms. Now, they weren't known for super industry. They weren't, right? They weren't trying to extract all the minerals they could out of the ground. So when settlers came, they said, well, we could actually build not just like we could live here, but really what we could do is really make this better. We could turn the desert into paradise, which is actually a claim that gets made through kibbutzes, and visually it's happened. Like through irrigation and science, they've greened up the desert. Like it's visually true. I mean, Israel exports fruit to Europe like a lot since the late 40s. So what happened? There was this thing called the Balfour Declaration. I mean, England oversaw that area, and they sort of said, well, sure, why don't you go settle, right? And then after World War II, world sympathy turned to there does need to be this homeland. And there was this very late declaration by the UN that passed only on the US's vote, otherwise it wouldn't have passed, that there could be this nation of Israel. And once that passed, there was a war. There was a war for Israeli independence because the Arab people who'd been living there decided, like, but this is our home.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't get to remove us through a UN declaration because we live here.
how did they get pushed into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank?
So, yeah, this is a long history, right? So they won the War of Independence, and Israel was real tiny, right? After 1948, Israel was like this big, just to give you an idea. And then there were a couple other wars because, hey, again, all the people who lived here now lived in tents outside of here. They lived in refugee camps for like decades. Many of them moved to Jordan. And if you know, Jordan actually got some land grab when this made, and Jordan was in charge of Jerusalem until the 6-Day War. So tensions escalated. There was this 6-day war. It really was won in 6 hours, to be honest, in which Israel defeated these other kind of superpowers. Then there was, and I think they even took the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Like they took all that too. How'd they do that? Can I just tell you the answer to that?
Yes, please.
They had the most advanced military weapons in the world. Where'd they get them? We sold them or gave them. Yeah. I'm not saying we shouldn't have. I just wanted to make sure we get this, right? I mean, when you're flying biplanes and these guys have F-14 Tomcats that they didn't develop, this is the truth. There's not much of a fight there, right? And that's what happened. Within an hour, all the planes got destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. So Israel expanded really big. And then you probably know about this other awful thing called the Yom Kippur War, where on Yom Kippur, the day of fasting and atonement, this is when sort of this coalition tried to do this scissor motion between Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, etc., and Jordan. And what do you know? They blew up all the Israeli planes now. So they did the same thing. And now it's going to be really hard to fight a modern war. So what happened is the United States didn't give them pilots, but we did give them planes. So sort of we flew the Tomcat over there and said, we're not fighting this war. The keys are in the ignition. So Israel did that one fine too, right? did that one fine too. And they were good sports. They gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt at the end of that, right? So there's been those two major conflicts, right? And then, sure, there's been lots of tension that's happened between, you probably know about like the Intifada. That happened when I was a kid, right? The Intifada was, and Yasser Arafat, probably, you know, who, let's just be honest, was a terrorist. Like Yasser Arafat was a terrorist. He ran the PLO, and the goal of the PLO was cause terror. And then he ended up winning the Peace Prize because he said, I won't do that anymore, right? I mean, that happened with Bill Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin, and Yitzhak Rabin's reward was he was assassinated by a Zionist, not by a Muslim, like by an Israeli, right? Because what they came up with was a two-state solution. And the two-state solution was, fine, you get this and that, and then we'll just keep everything else. That was the two-state solution. It took a long time to even have that happen and to have Israel recognize Palestine as a sovereign country. And since the two-state solution, there's been lots of encroachments by Jewish settlers who have built buildings in this land that was internationally agreed to be Palestinian. And you hear, well, these Palestinian people, they throw rocks at soldiers. How coarse. Well, they can't own guns. And what happens when they throw rocks? They get shot. I'm not saying something shouldn't have happened that did. That history is not ours. And what we usually see is, look, another terrorist attack. We don't see that. I mean, Mossad does not follow the Geneva Conventions. It's very well known that they'll like assassinate nuclear scientists. Like that's very well known in foreign countries, right? Like that's not how we're supposed to do things, you know. You probably even know there's a film, right? There were the Olympics in Munich where the Israeli athletes got killed, and Mossad, like, they sure tracked all those folks down. Because that's the deal, right? And they've made a big deal about also tracking down people who were involved in death camps. And so, like, yeah, I know this is all political, but this is also like part of Judaism today. It is. I don't mean all Jewish people are in on this. I just mean it's really complicated because this is the place where this is like the symbol in the world that it is safe to be Jewish, and that's not always the case. It's not always safe.
Yeah.
I don't know how to fix it. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, what we're doing though isn't working because it's not ending. I hope this is okay and not controversial to say. When people say, and I just think it's important to think about both sides, like who would ever hurt somebody's child? I mean, I don't know. I like to think I'm a pacifist, but if you hurt my daughter, I'd probably kill you. Like I would be willing to sacrifice my life in vengeance. That's really weird. I hope I wouldn't, but I don't know. You don't ever know till you're there. I was actually brought up that that's what you're supposed to do. Like that was the rearing I got at home. If somebody hurts your children, you make them pay. So why are these people hurting these people's children? Because they perceive their children have been hurt by those people. I mean, unless we do that link, they're all crazy and evil. But if I give you that link, you don't even have to agree with it. They perceive that these folks have hurt their kids. Well, that explains why they would be willing to hurt other kids. Because they're out of their minds. The situation is just that bad. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I get just a little, I'm not confused, but I can go either way with it. We started this. We dropped the atom bomb in Japan indiscriminately. We did the same thing in Germany. We did carpet bombing over there. I mean, And now we're criticizing people for doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, because it's not in our best interest. And I don't know if we started it. I think we responded in kind, or we responded in more than in kind, right? I mean, I think the thing is, it's helpful to remember, we'd like to think our hands are clean, and probably we've all got dirty hands.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And the question is, in the middle of dirty hands, what does cleanliness look like?
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly.
Mike,
You're
jumping
doing
back a
an
little bit.
Excellent job. I don't see any politics spoken in what you're saying, but to me, you're doing an excellent job of explaining to
Right.
us
Oh, yeah.
the history of what we remember. We didn't really pay that much attention
Yeah.
as these
Thank
things
you.
happen.
Yeah.
Just like the movie that we saw about Golden Mayer. And I saw that and I thought, where was I at that time? At that time, we were rearing children, working and doing other things, and we just read the news, but it didn't soak in.
No.
But I think you're doing an excellent job of just explaining
Yes.
both sides. You've been very neutral in your explanation.
I'd like to be neutral, actually, because when you're able to see both sides, you see that both sides are suffering. And you can see that if I were on one side suffering, I want to get even. I sure would, right? And getting even.
We just have a lot of emotions going right now.
We've got a lot of emotions right now, for sure. And, just one other detail, when this happened and people were moved out, the rule was you can't knock their houses over. So what they do, well, Israeli settlers moved into Palestinian homes and they still live there. And in violation of that decree, sometimes they do knock the house over and rebuild it. So these people who have grown up in tents, who weren't even born in that house, but they believe it's their house.
Because it was.
Because it is legally. That's the interesting thing. It's a forced exile.
Yeah. So it's their home place.
And that's why this is really, really confusing. And you know what? We as Americans, just honestly, territory is different to us because we're a young country and we have social mobility and whatever, right? But I do have folks who are very loath to sell the family farm because it has some kind of they're never going there again, but they just want to keep it somehow because losing that, right, is some kind of identity piece. So take that and put an exponent 4 on it. And that's what it's like when you live there. Yeah. This home was built by my great-great-grandfather. I was born in this home. My parents were born in this house. And now I have to live in a tent. I didn't vote. I didn't even fight for this. This is confusing. It's confusing. Yeah.
This is kind of a whole new direction, but I remember I remember 1948 when Israel was established, but I know that it gave rise to a lot of end of the world theories okay, now the generations alive now will stay alive until Messiah returns, and people that I was talking to back then at a very different time in my life were saying, well, that's 1988. And it was told me in 1981, so I fell for it for a while. And they got revised after 1988, but nothing really happened. And,
yeah, actually, if you want me to tell you the story, right, there's a book that's written, 88 Reasons the World's going to End in 1988. And actually, there were a number of congregations, you may not believe me, but this is relatively popular, that people were in church on the fateful night and hour waiting for the world to end. I don't mean 7 people. I mean, this happened all over the country that people were doing this. And then it was well, maybe it's going to be on Eastern time, or maybe that's happening on Mountain time. We better stay put. And it was this really big disappointment because, hey, the world didn't end. So guess what the book was in 89? 89 Reasons the World's going to End in 1989. And you want to know reason number 89? Yeah. It didn't end in 1988. And so what people did, right, and Christian people did this, not Jewish people, we're the dupes who fall for this, just to be really clear, is they kind of have this end-time apocalypticism based on, frankly, a very new read of the book of Revelation that is horribly inauthentic and inaccurate. We'll talk about that when we talk about Christianity, right? And so they kind of made this neo-religion out of a book that nobody wants to even read or understand and turned it into charts and maps and 7 seals of the beast and all of that, right? And somehow that actually became relatively mainstream in Christianity, even though it's crazy. I grew up that way. It's crazy. There's no historical authenticity at all. Like that's a 50-year-old delusion that we cooked up. End times prophecy. If you ever see end times prophecy on a book, don't buy it. If you're ever invited to go to a conference on end times prophecy, just
Don't go.
I think a nap would do you better. I just do. And so does Christian tradition for 2,000 years. We didn't believe in that crap. Okay, sorry. That I was very partisan right there. Yeah. So what do we get to do? We pray for peace. Hopefully we're able to hold that room that, hey, not all because somebody's a bad actor, that doesn't mean their whole race or religion are. Hopefully we can be like mature about that. Hopefully we can also seek to understand why somebody would do something that seems very awful. Like in general, people don't just do awful things. Usually they have bad reasons to do awful things, but they have some reasons. So I think that's maybe what we're asked to do. I was taught a couple years ago, last time there was a big conflict, the church I was at, and I was like the youth minister there, put on the billboard, pray for peace in Jerusalem. And our Palestinian Christian members were like, that's insulting to us.
Yeah.
So like that presumes who should be in charge and who's innocent and who's right. Because we don't live in Jerusalem, we're not allowed. And there is a large percentage of Palestinian Christians, it turns out.
Oh, yes, I know.
Not Palestinian Jews, but Palestinian Christians. And so you don't need to edit what other people say, but I would encourage you to pray for peace, just period.
Yeah.
Not just peace in Jerusalem. And maybe equity would be nice too. Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's partisan to say, like we can disagree about, borders and all that, but hopefully we can all agree that child poverty is not okay.
Absolutely.
I hope we can agree whether you're Democratic or Republican or Libertarian or Socialist, children growing up in extreme poverty is not okay. So we should do something about that. I don't know what it is. There's my Jewish conflict presentation.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah,
one question, going back a little bit. There's a Jewish post-wish next year in Jerusalem.
That happens every year at the Passover.
What's the context of that?
Yeah, great segue. Let me answer that, David, by actually flipping over and talking about Jewish festivals, because we'll talk about that with Passover. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
I'm not able to put these up because the TV is being really weird, but that's just fine. I'm just going to look at it to make sure I don't miss something as I'm want to do. So you're not really missing anything when I do this. If I were teaching this in a class, what I would have my students do is present each festival and present the food and sort of do that as a group project. Yes. I hate group projects, but that's what I would do. I just hate group projects. No, some people love them. Oh, no, some people love the group project because they get somebody like me who will do all of the work and they don't have to do anything. Yeah.
Who does all the work.
Yeah, no, we're the ones who hate the group projects, right? Probably most of us in the parish are like anti-group projects. Anyway. Before I do that, I did want to talk lastly about rights of renewal, and I mentioned this to you briefly. Again, it's not like there's mystical Jews and non-mystical Jews, or like mystical Jews and Jews that are conservative or reform. They're often blended, right? And so, as I mentioned to you, if from the Zohar, from Kabbalah, we're called by God to mend the world, tikkun olam. That's what that's called, the mending of the world. And so this idea that doing what's right, doing what's righteous, and remember, righteousness in Hebrew doesn't mean piety, it means justice. By practicing justice, we sort of put God back together. So it's not just a nice thing to tikkun olam, like you have to do it. The world is in pieces. Hey, actually, that seems pretty appropriate with what we just talked about, right? Mm-hmm. The world is in pieces. So it is our duty as God's people who are called by God to listen and to follow precepts to mend the world. And again, we do that through Tikkun Olam, and sometimes we do that through Teshuvah, that's repentance. I mentioned to you that there's these like kind of alms boxes, and it's called tzedakah, or tzedakah. It's righteous to share with people who don't have resources and assets. So that's actually a rite of renewal. Like, will you go to confession? Not so much. Will you try to mend the world with repentance? May not even just be like, I told a lie. Repentance could be like in this grand situation we've just been talking about. Yeah. Repentance might mean we got to do something because this isn't working. So how do we repent? And change the way we go forward so we don't keep ending up back here? What does it look like to mend the world? I hope that makes sense. So that's like I don't want to say that's a pillar, but that's a staple of what it means to have a rite of renewal. Of course, there's prayers of petition and praise, and there's prayers that you say uniquely to synagogue, and there's prayers that you say uniquely to Shabbat, and there's prayers for Yom Kippur. Like, each day's got its own thing. And so, yes, I like our Jewish brothers and sisters pray, and that's a rite of renewal, like it would be for Christians. Okay, now let's talk about festivals. So I mentioned to you that the Jewish calendar is based not on the solar calendar, but the lunar, but then it's also a hybrid, right? Because there's two Jewish festivals that have to happen at particular times of the year. And on a purely lunar calendar, they wouldn't happen at the right times. Those two are Passover, which is a spring harvest festival, and the other one is Sukkot, which just happened at the end of September. That's a fall harvest festival. So if you just let the moon dictate the calendar, you'd end up with the Sukkot in the middle of winter, and there's nothing to harvest. So when it starts getting too late, as I mentioned, you add a lunar month, which pushes it back. So every couple of years, you'll see it getting later and later, and then all of a sudden it'll be way early, and that was on purpose. When does the calendar begin? Well, theoretically, it begins on Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the year. Rosh is your head. The Shana is the year, so it's the head of the year. Although if you read the Hebrew Bible, there's actually, depending which book you read, there's four different beginnings of the year, and Passover is one of them, and Sukkot's another one. So in general, Rosh Hashanah. But I can't just talk to you about that, because Rosh Hashanah happens. This is what rabbis are great about doing, right? Lots of, by the way, Tim Brown looked this up for us. Last week we talked about how a mezuzah is usually at a little bit of a slant, right? And according to what Tim found is, you may want to lay it sideways. There was a party that wanted it sideways so it would look like a scroll. Right? That's how you read a scroll, and there's a scroll in it. And there was another group, a strong Jewish group, that wanted it to be straight up and down, pointing you up to God. So what they do, they compromise. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So there's your mezuzah lesson. But there's another thing that happens that's again, some people say this kind of is like the prequel to the new year, and it's called Tish B'Av. There's a month, a Hebrew month called Av, and the Tish is the day of the month. And what happens on Tish B'Av is the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Now, I mentioned to you historically that happens actually twice. The one Solomon built, and then the one that Herod had expanded and turned into a wonder world. According to the tradition, the temple was destroyed on the same day of the same month. Twice. That's the tradition. No one cares if it's historically accurate, but that's the tradition. So Tish B'Av is sort of begins a series of what's called the Days of Wonder. And it begins with loss, actually. It does. It begins with loss. And this is an interesting thing. If you're maybe you know this about how folks kind of reckon time in the world. there's the accusation, and we'll talk about this later, I'm not sure it's totally true, that Eastern folks believe that time happens in a cycle. So here we are again, here we are again, here we are again, right? Greek folks have this idea that time has a discrete beginning and then goes forward. And probably the better understanding, and we do this in the sort of in the Roman Catholic Episcopal Church, we kind of have a blend of the two, where things are going somewhere and there's some uniqueness to them, but well, we find ourselves at Advent again, don't we? Right. So there are these sort of grooves in time, right? And this is kind of where the holidays, the Jewish holidays, find as well too. They're not just linear. Tish B'Av, like, yeah, there's loss and there's destruction, and then we cope and we find something new. Hey, without the loss of the temple, we wouldn't have rabbinic Judaism. But next year on Tish B'Av, it might be that we're actually grieving something that's happened in our family, and we do that in sort of in the space of the loss of the container for holiness we used to rely on. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's about a historical event, but it's a life event that resonates with us. So Tish B'Av's the beginning of that, and then it leads it up, sure enough, to Rosh Hashanah. Now, I've mentioned this to you from the pulpit, but the significance of Rosh Hashanah is not just the beginning of the year, but because time belongs to God, Rosh Hashanah is where God writes your fate for the year. It turns out you have time to edit your fate. You have 8 days, but Rosh Hashanah is when your fate's written, and it's sealed on Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur, you can read about this in the scriptures. It shows up in both Exodus and in Deuteronomy, and also some descriptions in Leviticus, because that's a book for priests, and it's how priests are meant to put this on, means the Day of Atonement. So between the year beginning and the Day of Atonement, you can do repentance or teshuvah and change the fate God's written for you. How do you do that? Well, it's not just that you give money to the synagogue or that you say a bunch of prayers. If you have hurt someone or they've hurt you, you're meant to be reconciled. And if you don't, then you're probably going to live into a year of estrangement again. Now, depends what kind of Jewish person you are, just like it depends what kind of Christian person you are. God writes your fate, which means if you don't change it, God will make things happen to you. That's one view. Another view is, boy, I've been living in estrangement, and if I don't make it right, I'm going to keep living in estrangement. So I'm either going to change this fate or it's going to be sealed. We don't change the way we treat the planet, we might be sealing our fate, if you believe in such things. Not everybody does, it turns out. Right? And so that matters. Right? What your belief matters, because if you don't believe that there's climate change, then you have no incentive to change any behaviors. Right? So that's where belief becomes important. If you don't believe that there's a problem in the Middle East that is happening between both sides, there's no incentive to do anything different. It's just those damn Palestinians. I mean, that's honestly where belief matters, right? So Rosh Hashanah is actually like a pretty happy day. Some people say that this is the day in which human beings were created. This is part of the legend. That's why the year begins. This is when Adam and Eve were created. And usually people eat sweet things like an apple cake, apples and honey. Yeah. The apple's an interesting thing, right? Because like we usually say that's what Eve ate in the garden, although the Quran's really clear it was a pomegranate. Because apples like aren't indigenous. So there's that, right? But anyway, apple cake, sweet things, because you want a sweet year. I mean, that's sort of what you're praying to God for. And then you've got this 8 days, not of fasting. So you're not going to fast between the two. You're just going to try to make things right with folks. And this is a really important thing. Our Jewish brothers and sisters get this, and so do alcoholics. It's like the 10th step, that you try to make repair for relationships that you've damaged, except when doing so would make them worse. I can tell you, Christian people don't understand this, because Christian people hear sermons about, hey, like forgiveness and let's make things right. And then they'll go to people they've hurt and demand that they be forgiven, because their preacher said that's what they're supposed to do. And in so doing, they make things much worse, right? Because you're demanding that the victim who you have victimized lets you off the hook for doing something. And our Jewish folks are a little wiser than that. just to be clear, it doesn't work where you demand to be forgiven, or that you do this thing that the Christians, or the tradition I grew up in, will say, like let's pretend we're in a disagreement and I perceive John L's done the wrong thing to me, and I'll say, well, John L, I forgive you. And hopefully John L say, I didn't do anything wrong, you can kiss my butt, right? Like, I don't need your forgiveness, I need you to change your behavior, right? Like, sometimes we distort that in a terrible way, right? By making forgiveness a premium that we dole out as beneficiaries, or a thing that's ours to demand. Because if you won't forgive me, then you're sinning. You raped me. I don't have to forgive you. I hope this is clear what I'm saying. So this isn't done tritely, and even in our tradition, it shouldn't be. Forgiveness is not your right to demand. And as your priest, I'm going to tell you, you don't have to give it. I think God hopes you will, but I think also God hopes you'll be shrewd. Forgiveness doesn't mean you let somebody continue to abuse you.
Right.
I can forgive someone and never see them again. So that's the kind of repair I'm talking about. What happens on Yom Kippur? As I mentioned, your fate is sealed, and it's a day in which you act like you're dead. You do this by not eating or drinking. So fasting is of both types for the whole day, and you cannot have any physical intimacy with somebody else, because corpses don't do that, right? So it really is this day of living into this liminal space of like pretending to be dead so that you can go forward with some new life. And, actually, if you read what Paul says in Romans chapter 6, this is kind of his understanding of baptism is we die to the way that we were so that we don't keep carrying that crap around and we can live a new life. That's the image of baptism, is death to the burdens I've been carrying. So now I can be unencumbered. Almost right after Yom Kippur is one of the 4 principal feasts of Sukkot. Now, by the way, if you are Jewish, you need to go to the synagogue on that day. Like that's your Christmas and your Easter rolled into one day. Like you better go. And if you don't pay your dues, you don't get a seat, as we talked about last week. So you need to pay your dues, or you can't have Christmas and Easter this year. And you need to have Christmas and Easter, right? You all get that, right? By the way, just to mention historically, Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, or even some of our Jewish and Christian theologians, they both do this. Sometimes we think atonement means a thing has to die, which is not necessarily the case. Sometimes they say it's their day of at-one-ment. So we found ourselves estranged from God, mostly because we followed, as we say in the prayer book, the devices and desires of our own centers of will. So now we want to come back and be at one. And when there was a temple, the mechanism was twofold. There was something called Holocaust. That was a heifer without blemish that was completely burned. No one ate any of it. The life force was sprinkled on people. That's through blood. That actually didn't do anything for your sins at all. And this wasn't about individual sin. This was about community sin. We don't think about that because we're too individualistic now. Religion that raised me, it's about you and God, not how evangelicals have sold their soul to support partisan politics. They have. I'll be very, very upfront about that, right? Very strange thing that we say our hope is in Jesus Christ, but then we put it on people who don't even embody Christian principles because somehow they're going to be our savior. That's very odd. That's the thing that, frankly, evangelicals need to atone for. And they don't need to kill an animal to do it. They just need to stop that shit. Like, it's crazy. So sorry to my evangelicals watching it, but it's true. Like, we sold our souls for I don't know what. The real way this was dealt with in the Hebrew Bible was that the high priest put their hands on a goat, and then the goat was driven out into the desert. You couldn't kill the goat, because if the goat died in your presence, your stuff is still there. You have to say, you are not one of us. It is the scapegoat, right? That's interesting. In Hebrew, the word is Azazel. That's the scapegoat. And if you read the pseudepigraphal book of 1 Enoch, the guy who leads the rebellion in heaven that we usually call the devil is called the Azazel. And we all understand the word scapegoat because we learned that in middle school when we learned about the Holocaust, that Jews were the scapegoats of the Nazis. So they took a Jewish word, scapegoat, kind of a liturgical thing, and applied it to acts in history. They don't do either one of those things anymore. There's no temple, so you don't do that. You go to the synagogue, you read portions of the Torah, you pray and you fast, and you get ready for all of that by seeking reconciliation when it's appropriate. Then when that's over, you do Sukkot. And Sukkot is, as I mentioned to you, a fall harvest festival. Initially, it seems historically that's all it was. So there's 4 particular things you have to have in your possession to celebrate the Sukkot. A zitrog, which is like a kind of citrus fruit that's somewhere between an orange and a lemon. And it's pretty big. You need to have a willow branch, and there's a gourd, and then there's something else. Now, you're not going to eat the willow branch, but you're going to wave it because that's when they bloom, is in the fall, right? So these are fall things. And you always have them at Sukkot. You must have them. And then after the harvest part, there's this other thing that you may know about where you have to build a booth. So a sukkah is a booth or a tabernacle. If you've ever heard of the Feast of Tabernacles, it's Sukkot, like it's the same thing. And a tabernacle is basically meant to connect you to your history of wandering through the desert looking for a place to live. So our Jewish brothers and sisters are ordered to, it's a mitzvah, like you have to do this, to build a sukkah in your yard. And the rules are you have to be able to see stars in the sky. So it can't be weatherproof. Or if it is, it's got to have a window. You've got to be able to look up, right? And in general, you go out and you eat your meals in the sukkah. You don't have to sleep in it, but for fun you could, right? And the story is, it's really important. You don't say, our ancestors wandered in the desert. During Sukkot, you say, we wandered in the desert. So it is a way of doing this thing that we often don't get in the hyphen help. These festivals are a way of remembering, not something, I forgot and I remember, like I'm attaching myself physically to that story. That story happened and is happening. I'm still an alien in a foreign land looking for home, even if I have a house I've lived in for 30 years. I don't know if that makes sense. I think we're all probably, this is like seems to be a basic human archetype, is we sometimes feel ourselves far from home because of death or loss or boredom or injury. We can feel far from home. So this is your festival. You go out and you say, I am far from home. I'm wandering. And it happens at the fall. The next thing that happens, and it's a few months off, and it comes, well, sorry, let me interject. I think I told you this a couple of weeks ago. Hanukkah has become a Jewish party. It's not in the Bible anywhere because it didn't happen in the Bible. It happened after the Hebrew Bible was written. sometime around 167. And I mentioned to you this general, Judas Maccabeus, who may not have been a real person, wanted to celebrate Sukkot in Jerusalem and didn't get there in time. He got there late. And when he got there, they waited. So they did this bad thing. They didn't do Sukkot at the right time. You're supposed to do it at the fall. He did it in the winter, because that's when they took it. And you know probably the story. There was only enough consecrated oil for one day. And it took, turns out, 8 days to consecrate more oil. And the one-day oil lasted 8 days. So it became the Festival of Lights. Hanukkah is Sukkot. It's the same thing, celebrated late. Until the 1930s, no one cared about Hanukkah. I mean, they did it. You had latkes because they're cooked in oil, right? So this is a feast of oil. But when Christmas became a big deal in the 50s and on, it wasn't before the 50s, right? Like you didn't get thousands of dollars worth of gifts. But now it's a bigger deal, right? And as I mentioned to you, you put in your window, and the rule is it has to be seen, not the menorah, that has 7. You don't put that in your window. That belongs at a temple. You put in the Hanukkah. And you've seen me do this in church. There's 8 days, but there's 9 things, right? So the one in the middle is taller than the other 8. It's called the Shemesh, which means sun in Hebrew. It's the lighter. You can light the Shemesh with a match or a lighter, but you can only light the other 8 candles with the Shemesh. How many candles does it take to run? This is a great math problem. John will solve it. How many candles does it take to effectively run the Hanukkah? Well, the first day, keep in mind, you're going to light 1, and it burns all the way down. It takes about an hour. They're very slender candles. And you're going to light the Shemesh, and guess what? That's also going to burn all the way down. So the first day, I'm lighting 2 candles. But the second day, I have to light 3 candles. The first and the second day, and the Shemesh. You see how that goes?
Yeah.
The very last day, I'll light 9. I think it's 45. I think it's a pack of 45 candles to celebrate 8 days. During that time, it is customary you might receive a gift a day. That's become the new custom. And the gifts may not be large, or they may be. It just depends on your home. I mean, honestly, American Christmas giving has now infiltrated the world, basically. I mean, Muslims celebrate Christmas now. Harry Potter does too. I don't know if you've read those books. There's nothing religious in the books, but boy, it's Christmas time, Harry. I mean, that's kind of now a season. I think they're right about that. Like the whole tree and ornaments and the gifts on the 25th, that's actually pretty new. You know, the older traditions on St. Nicholas Day, you got oranges in your shoes, right? That's the European tradition. Well, now if kids got oranges, they'd like throw them at their parents, right? Like who wants an orange? But you couldn't even have citrus, right? I mean, that they were really precious to have the orange, right? So
we had an orange in our stock.
But remember, the blossoming of Christmas really happens after the Second World War.
50s,
when you come out of a long period of austerity into an affluent society.
Yeah, and my mother grew up very poor, but Christmas was the one time of the year where they got things, and their parents would save, you know, knowing you weren't getting anything else like the rest of the year. This was your day, right? Yeah. Post World War II, you got it.
Well, I think that they didn't have Christmas in Scotland until like 1958, I think, something like that.
Well, they do New Hogmanay.
Yeah.
They do
right.
New Year's Eve
That's
as big,
Yeah.
at least as big.
It's interesting that we sometimes get narrow. Like most of you don't burn a Yule log, right?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is a pagan symbol. Anyway, so the Christmas tree. Other thing happens during Hanukkah, right, that's famous is the dreidel, which I think I mentioned to you may have been a way that Ladino converts fooled their inquisitors. Oh, we're just playing this dreidel game. And when the folks left, they went back to praying from the Siddur. Don't know. But, there's the little chocolate coins. That's called Geld. That's the German word for money. Anyway, as I mentioned, Yiddish is mostly German, right? So that's what you do. You gamble for Geld. And that's part of Hanukkah. Next thing that happens, usually in the spring and before Passover, usually, it's the Feast of Purim or Purim. And that comes from the least important book in the Jewish Bible, the book of Esther. It is the least important book because God's name is never mentioned in it. And if you're looking at the Jewish Bible, it comes dead last. In the Christian Bible, Esther is sort of in the first 2/3. But we've reordered the Hebrew Bible books to suit our interest, opposed to theirs. It is a spring carnival, and it is actually it will probably be, it gets to be a bigger deal because it is really the remembrance of the first pogrom. If you know the Esther story, there was a man who didn't like a Jewish guy, and so he decided he'd kill all Jewish people. And that man's name was Haman. And the one who saves the day is Esther, who is an unknown Jew. So she's the emperor's chief consort. She's not a wife. And I don't know how fundamentalist Christians can make a movie called A Night with the King. Has anybody seen A Night with the King? No. It's a movie about Esther and how, she's this righteous lady. The way she becomes the emperor's chief consort is by sleeping with him, to be clear, and pleasing him more than the other women do. That sounds like an NC-17 movie to me, not one that you should get from Mardell, but that's what they've made, right? So be a good kingly wife. Again, the way you do that is not fit for public consumption. So that's what Esther does. And what do you know? There's this ironic reversal where Haman, the evil guy, gets hoisted on his own petard. He builds a 70-foot gallows for Mordecai, and in the end, he gets hanged on his own gallows. And what happens on Purim is you wear costumes. So I don't want to call it Jewish Halloween, but it's like Jewish Halloween because Esther's identity was secret. So you wear the costume. Almost all synagogues will have a Purim carnival, which has like pony rides and fair games and food. Like that's fun. It's kind of like the fall festival. But religiously, you go into the synagogue and you read the whole book of Esther. And here's the other kicker. You're supposed to drink so much wine that you can't differentiate between the names Mordecai and Haman.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of a lot of wine. Now, it turns out that we think Hitler's the worst. Hitler is a type of Haman. So if you're Jewish, like Haman is the original Hitler because he was going to commit complete genocide. And when the story's read, you get this thing called a grogger, which is like when you twist it. And every time Haman's name is read, you're supposed to either boo or clap. But in usual, you use the grogger because you don't want to hear such an evil name. The sweet is a cookie shaped like a triangle with jelly in it. It's called a Hamantaschen, which means Haman hat. I guess he had quite the hat. And so you celebrate by eating his head. Well, you eat his hat, right? To show that pogroms will not have power over you. So it's actually a really interesting holiday, not necessarily of religion, but of survival. And consider that after the Yom Kippur War, Purim was a big deal. The Yom Kippur War was another pogrom, right? The Holocaust was like the ultimate pogrom since this one, right? So this is a feast about survival. Hence the joy of wine, and you do overdo it. Like you're encouraged to be drunk. It's not tolerated, like you're supposed to be drunk. Because you survived. I mean, you survived against all odds. Like that's the deal. The next big one that comes up is Pesach, or we usually call it Passover. Pesach's the Hebrew word, and then you probably know this is how we Latinize it, from which we get the word Paschal. So when we do a baptism, when we do a funeral, we have that big white candle. That's the Paschal candle. We've made that about Jesus, but it's Passover, right? The Passover story, you probably know if you've read the book of Exodus or seen the Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments from Cecil B. DeMille, right? Which is that the people were enslaved. God keeps saying, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. So there's these plagues, right? And there's gnats and there's flies, and the Nile turns to blood. And in the end, there's going to be a plague on all the firstborn, right? And the way you avoid having your firstborn cattle and slaves and children of slaves and your own children die, only boys, it doesn't affect girls at all, is that you are supposed to eat this particular meal. All right, so the meal is a roasted lamb, and it's gross. Like I know Cajun people who will eat anything, and they won't eat a lamb roasted with its innards in. But that's how you do it. You don't even gut the lamb. Why not? Because you don't have time. This is so time sensitive. Like this is like Moses at 10 p.m. saying, we're leaving at 4 a.m. and you need to eat a whole lamb before you go because it's a long journey. So you don't have time to season it and brine it. You don't have time to smoke it. I mean, you just basically slit the lamb's neck, bleed it out, and then you just cook it. And you cram it, and you're eating it with your shoes on and your backpack on, and your bag's like packed nearby because we're out the door. And you pour the blood. I think I told you this a couple of weeks ago. This is part of kosher, right? You can't have blood at all. You can't have the life force of the animal. Normally you pour it into the ground, but on this night, you put it on your doorpost. What does that mean? I mean, I don't know. It means a lot of different things, but probably it means you're showing, I'm not claiming the life force of the animal. It's yours. And when you do that, then God will spare you. So people get spared, and that's it. Now, at the meal, this always happens. So if you're at a retirement home and everybody's been Jewish for their whole life, you still have to have this same synthetic dialogue. It's called the Haggadah or the Haggadah. And really the question is, why is this night different from other nights? And then there's 4 questions. Why do we eat bitter herbs? The youngest person in the room asked that question. The oldest person answered it. Because our slavery was bitter. Why do we eat this haraset? Haraset is like apples and cranberries that's been like smashed, and it's got honey in it, and it's not supposed to be sweet. It's supposed to be the mortar from the bricks they made in slavery, right? Because we had to make the bricks, right? So it's very scripted that you do this. The oldest person always, and why do we eat flatbread instead of challah? Because there was no time for the bread to rise. There's a reminder, in Egypt, they didn't have Fleischmann's yeast packets. Yeast came from the air or it came from sourdough, and there wasn't enough time in either case for that stuff to rise. There was yeast in it. It wasn't like there was no yeast. You can't live without yeast, right? Yeast is bacteria. It just didn't have time to rise the bread. So now the way you do Passover is you don't eat yeast the whole week, and you also have to clean all the yeast out of your home. So if anything in the pantry's got yeast, you give it to your Gentile neighbor, or you put it in storage for a week, but it can't be in the house. And you wipe off the pantry, right? So there's no residues of yeast, and you do that in the fridge too. At the end of the Passover, you say next year in Jerusalem. And why do you say that? Because your hope is to go to the homeland. Not necessarily to live, but to visit, and this is the high holy day, right? So this is the Feast of Deliverance. Our ancestors were headed to Jerusalem. I mean, you have to imagine that the people in Egypt were saying this too. Next year in Jerusalem, not in Egypt. Took them 40 years to get there, and they didn't get Jerusalem for a long time. All right, so next year, a home that is not in bondage. And part of it is you don't say, well, a long time ago, people were slaves. We were slaves in Egypt, and you delivered us. Not them, but us. So that's part of the Haggadah as well. It happens in Passover.
You're back into the remembering.
That's it. And by the way, I would tell you, Episcopal Roman Catholic churches do this really well at Holy Week. As evangelicals, we did not do any Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday Easter Vigil. We didn't do that stuff. No, it's not, no one meant that we were unaware of those days. We actually knew the scriptures really well as evangelical, but we didn't like participate in them, if that makes sense. Like we didn't physically invest ourselves in that drama. I don't know why evangelicals don't, because like it's really interesting way to remember the story is to like strip the altar and pull all the finery out, you know, like it's dramatic. And to sit there by candlelight for an hour on a Sunday morning at 6 a.m., like it's dramatic, right? Like it's, anyway, that's how we remember. Those are some of the ways we do it. And so Passover does this. I think I mentioned to you, you can have a Seder. The meal is called the Seder. You can have that if you want. Just sign up in your local paper. Like you can go and you can say, hey, no offense, I'm Christian and all. And people shouldn't say to you, like, get out. Like, you bought your ticket, you get to sit there, and you do have to pay. But so does everybody else. You're paying for the catering. I think I mentioned to you, since the destruction of the second temple, no more lamb at these events. Because that's considered a sacrifice. I told you it's an irregular sacrifice because a priest doesn't kill it, you do. Right? Every family kills their own lamb. Wasn't time to bring it to the priest. So you did it yourself. And I did want to make sure I mentioned this. I probably did already. This is not a sin offering. It never was. You went for sin, you went on that day. On this day, it's about get out of bondage and get out quick. So Jesus is the Paschal Lamb. It's interesting that most people understand that as sacrifice for sin instead of food for the journey out of whatever bondage we find ourselves in. I like the second one a lot better for lots of reasons. It's not gross, for one thing, and then it actually asks us to do something. It asks us to leave and help other people get out of prisons. Jesus can still be a sacrifice for sin if you want that to be the case, but the Paschal mystery, right, is that he calls us out of bondage. And Jesus doesn't say like, oh, I see you're miserable and suffering. I'll tell you what, I'll just forgive your sins and leave you there. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. As evangelicals, we sort of thought, well, forgiveness is all you need because life is miserable and you go to heaven when you die. No, the Paschal mystery is, why don't you just start going to heaven now? And God would like to take you there now and later. That might have been partisan again. Sorry. Then the other one is, and this usually happens a couple months later, Shavuot or Shavut. And this is the celebration of, usually the celebration of Moses receiving the Torah. So what happens on Shavuot or Shavut is you read the whole Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So you're in synagogue a long time if you go. And also there's sweet things eaten, honey cakes, because the Torah is sweet. It's not bitter. And these are like the major Jewish festivals. And I left off HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. But that goes in here. It goes after this, and it goes before Tish B'Av. And then you sort of cycle through. And there's some other ones, right? There's other festival days, but these are the sort of the bigger ones. Look, I'm just at the perfect amount of time. Are there questions about this? Or something else I missed? Well, thanks for your attentiveness. I'll try to fix the technical difficulties. I think we'll do one more next week. We'll do kind of a wrap up as best we can, and then we'll decide kind of what we want to do next, if we want to do anything next. That sounds good.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And that's, this is, yeah.
I can find out.